is that you believe a lot of the New Testament is unarguably factually true.
I do, yeah, and I think that that's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Jesus Christ actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection. And then, if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity, because obviously, if he was, then that is a miracle. And then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it?
Even the Apostle Paul says that. He says, if Jesus Christ is not raised from the dead, our faith is futile, it is worthless, it is vain. Everything in the Christian faith hinges on the historical reality of Christ's resurrection.
Where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Pierce, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who is said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant, they're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. And what we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And this happened over the course of, as Luke in his combination, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, says over the course of 40 days. This wasn't a short event. And so there were as many as, Paul says, up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event before his ultimate, resurrecting, going to the ascension of the right hand of the Father.
The most important argument with this is the fact that, and many people cite this, is the fact that you don't die for a lie. And if in the conscience those who were eyewitnesses of Jesus believed and were making up all of this, stuff about his resurrection, they wouldn't have died for it. They would have given it up and gone back to just kind of a normal a form of Judaism, right? Because they were willing to die for it, really validates that it happened.
Argument is that Paul the Apostle wasn't there for the resurrection himself, and there's no other reference really, other than I think the 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's only one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at something that we can try to historiographically explain, we look at the various explanations and then we account for the data. So you're correct in the sense that 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once. However, when you corroborate those with the accounts that we find, particularly in Matthew, Luke, and John, I think it does explain, especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended. Even the fact that we have one instance of this being spoken about, and then we can look at the individuals Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then others in the New Testament documents that talk about the resurrection of Jesus. That even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think we have to explain these particular instances where we don't just have people who are friendly to this happening, but we have individuals who are actually hostile. In James, the brother of Jesus, who the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family was actually very hesitant in how public Jesus' ministry was. Then we have likewise Paul, who started his life as a persecutor, and that has a radical 180 in terms of him then going on and writing the majority of Holy Scripture within the New Testament.
But it's even more than that, because the claim of the Apostle Paul is that on the road to Damascus, he encountered the risen Lord in something like a manifestation or Christophany of God within time, space, and history. So that is the central piece to why the Apostle Paul became an apostle in the first place. It's not just because he agreed with the propositions, but that the Lord actually showed up and changed his direction. And furthermore, that, as he says, the Lord actually taught him while he was in Arabia. It's so important to remember about the Apostle Paul. It's not like he had YouTube. It's not like he had Chat GPT to try to kind of figure out what the core teachings of the gospel are. So when he goes to the apostles and is able to articulate and explain the gospel that they had received from the risen Christ, the ascended Christ, and when Paul comes back and says he met me and he encountered me and he taught me, and he says pretty much the exact same thing about of what Jesus taught them, the only conclusion is that Jesus actually did commission him. Jesus actually did meet him in time, space, and history. That's the crux of the issue when we're talking about the apostleship of Paul.
To play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Because we're in the same position that the disciples were. They didn't have a notion that Jesus was going to rise from the dead, even though he taught it all the time. I actually think it proves the fact that they were doubting, that they didn't actually believe it at first. It adds to the credibility because they didn't know it was going to happen. It stunned them. If you don't know something is going to happen and then it actually happens within, the real world, a real world miracle, um, that only adds to the credibility because there's no assumption that you are going to maintain, um, you know, the belief or the submission um, to Jesus. I think one of the more powerful arguments is that in a culture of antiquity, it makes sense that perhaps people would die not for necessarily the truth, but because they had given their life to a rabbi who taught them. And so you basically have to ask yourself the question, especially in light of the Gospels, where they're just not getting anything. They're often depicted as weak when they're given opportunities to stand on Jesus' side in the midst of great trial. For example, Peter, he fails. So there's a necessary portrayal of the disciples as weak and frail and not wholeheartedly committed, not realizing what it would actually take to follow Jesus. And of course, the question is, what happened in them that they would be willing to die for the thing that, probably just a couple of years earlier, for example, with Peter, he wasn't even able to identify and say that he was a disciple of Jesus. If he was working from his own human capacity, he wouldn't have died crucified upside down. I think that's pretty clear with Peter. So the fact that he did, I think, shows the fact that he saw it. And if you saw Jesus appear before you, like Paul, like Peter, and it became clear who he was and what he was actually doing, you would do anything for him. You would die for him. There is a really, really staunch staunch reality that comes with being clearly illumined to what reality and who it is and what it is, that you would die for it, even if you're a weak human. That, I think, is the best evidence.
Few things going on there in terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things. We only have witness testimony. You do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history, in one sense, is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo, when we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus's death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar-Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. One of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
And I think that is the best argument. It's not as if the disciples were gaining prestige, power, or money influence by claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. They were actually invoking and inciting persecution. For example, Stephen is a perfect example. There was nothing to gain in this world that normally people, if they are living in contrary to their conscience, is probably because they're getting something that they want out of it. There was absolutely nothing to gain for the disciples in preaching Christ crucified and risen from the dead. Even the sermon of Peter on Pentecost, you killed him. That probably wasn't the easiest or best thing to say to maintain peace and harmony, let's say. Yet they proclaimed it, even unto death. He said, this Christian scholar Wes Huff said that some of them died, nearly all of them died. And they actually knew that it was going to happen because it seems that Jesus had said it was going to happen. So what explains the supernatural, miraculous courage for why they lived the way that they did? Nobody does that for a lie. And the only people that would do it for the lie is because they would see getting some end out of it. And it wouldn't have been the end that the disciples would have sought to proclaim Christ from. Do you get what I'm saying? This is so important and a crucial perspective. Piers Morgan talks from that stupid chronological snobbery that we Westerns have, that somehow we're more advanced, somehow we have better arguments and understandings. They were illiterate, as if that has anything to do with the ability to perceive reality. I think they're smarter personally. I think they're smarter because they don't have all of this, literally this philosophical post-enlightenment garbage feeding their mind that literally gets them to think that they are the subject of the universe, gets them to think that everything is relative, and if it benefits them, they'll be better off. They could actually look into the world and perceive God, not just look inward and think about it. They saw it, they knew it was true because they saw it, they didn't question that. And just think about how insane it is that we in our society question it. We live in a culture of self-invention, as Bishop Barron talks about. We live in a relativistic age. We live in an autonomous individual age. As Bishop Barron has said, modernity is a heresy. Further, modernity is insanity. And to assume that we can think better than the ancient people, first century Jews in Israel, is chronological snobbery, and we need to avoid that. Jesus has revealed himself in time, space, and history, as I've been saying a lot to time, space, and history. For some reason, that seems like a good way of explaining things in my mind, that the only way you could deny the reality of his resurrection is if you just don't want it to be true. So you deny the evidence, you deny the facts, you have a hardened heart and a depraved mind. That's really what it is. And that is why he came, to remove all of that, so that we could see clearly and perceive salvation in him. We're thinking about that today.